On the Brain Possible podcast, we talk weekly with practitioners, parents, caregivers, and experts who share their knowledge on a variety of treatments and issues that matter to you. Today, our guest is Dr. Pejman Katiraei. Dr. K is a board-certified pediatrician in Santa Monica who is particularly passionate about helping children who suffer from severe learning and behavioral challenges. Dr. K is also boarded and fellowship trained in integrative and holistic medicine. He completed his undergraduate at UCLA and then obtained his osteopathic medical degree at Western University of Health Sciences. He completed his pediatric residency at Loma Linda University, where he stayed on as Pediatric Chief Resident and then as a teaching faculty for over 4 years while he founded the Loma Linda University Holistic Medicine Clinic. Dr. K also completed 2 fellowships in integrative medicine, one with the University of Arizona, and Dr. K's second fellowship was in Endobiogeny, a European systems biology medical model. He is one of a few physicians in the country with mastery of osteopathy, functional medicine, functional endocrinology, medical herbalism, and more. He is now in private practice in Santa Monica, where he focuses on helping children with severe behavioral challenges. He's also working with an amazing team to build Wholistic Minds, an online portal that helps parents understand the root cause of their child's behavioral issues and what steps that they can take to help resolve them. Thank you so much for joining me here today on the Brain Possible podcast. It's an honor to speak with you and to have this opportunity to learn from you.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with your community.
Well, so how did you come to do the work that you do? Can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you became passionate about working with children with learning and behavioral challenges?
It's kind of a funny story, and I think when you say divine intervention, had you asked me 15 years ago, hey, you'd be doing pediatrics with a focus on pediatric behavioral health, I'd look at you funny and be like, what are you talking about? And when I was in my med school years, I actually had no idea I liked working with kids at all. And my plan certainly was not to go into pediatrics. In fact, I was actually thinking of going into adult medicine and possibly healthcare administration. And then I did my pediatric rotation, and all of a sudden, I remember it vividly. It's like there were little butterflies and unicorns and like rainbows. And literally I was like, what is going on? Like, why is this experience so different than everything else that I've had? And why am I having this borderline, like magical, like phenomenon happening? And that's when I realized, like, God, I really love working with kids, and I connect with these kids and they mean everything to me. And even to this day, like, so that was 2002, when I did my first pediatric rotation. So fast forward almost 20 years, every interaction with kids, is awesome to me. And I love being around them. I love helping them. I love doing whatever I can to keep them healthy. And, the behavioral piece was something that I became cognizant of probably about 10 years ago when I started getting more and more into the world of integrative medicine. And initially, it was really to understand myself, because as a adolescent and young adult, I had my fair share of challenges, anxiety, trouble focusing, other things. And I really wanted to understand why I felt so different in comparison to people around me. And, I started by learning about MTHFR and blah, blah, blah. And that was just a rabbit hole that had no end. And as I got better at taking care of myself and a handful of people, more people started becoming attracted to me. And then I got to a place where I'm like, wow, I really love working with these kids. And, the kids that I take care of are not the run-of-the-mill ADHD where they have a little bit of trouble focusing and they take Adderall and everything's better. It's the kids who are sadly falling apart, who can't learn at all. They're calling themselves, I hate to say this, but I mean, they're like, am I stupid? Literally these 8-year-olds, 6-year-olds are like, am I dumb? I hate learning. And it's heartbreaking to even imagine what a child would have to go through to get to a place where they start thinking of themselves as dumb, thinking of themselves as stupid, or you get the other kids who just can't regulate and they can't manage their emotions and they act out and they freak out and they're highly anxious and highly reactive. And then these are the kids that are like, am I bad? Do you think I'm bad? You know, and again, these are 8-year-olds that are starting to form these images of themselves. And you know, it was about 3 years ago that I just got to a place where I said, holy Jesus, like there's so many kids that are suffering, and there are some good people out there helping them, but we've barely scratched the tip of the iceberg in terms of our understanding of what's going on with these kids. And we certainly don't have enough people working to make a difference for these kids. And that's where I decided to really dedicate myself, you know, the vast majority of my energy and time to try to help these kids.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that because I know the rates for a lot of different mental health and behavioral challenges and autism even are rising. And even things such as eczema and these words we're hearing about, candida, I was just listening to you talk about. So what are your thoughts on why you're seeing more and more of this?
I think it's a culmination of a lot of things. I think we're becoming more aware.
Yeah.
And you know, before we would just be like, oh, like when I had my challenges as a kid, like, you know, it was just kind of like, well, you just tough it out and you just deal with it. And thank God, you know, my challenges were not as severe as what I see in some of the kids. I think today, part of what we're seeing is, you know, between the changes in the foods that we have, and we have all learned that, you know, the gluten of today is not the gluten that was there 40, 50 years ago. The dairy that most people consume is different, and the way the cows are fed is different. And then you add to that all of the chemicals and compounds and glyphosates and plastics, and you add the psychological and social challenges. And then we've got the antibiotics that have, you know, there's so many things, and it's hard to point to one thing, because when you look at just glyphosates by themselves, and it's just like, wow, like these things, this one compound can do so much to compromise the gastrointestinal tract and the microbiome. And then you add plastics and how they change mitochondrial functioning and hormones, and you keep going, and all of a sudden you start seeing like there's this soup of compounds and chemicals and exposures that are around us, some of which we probably can't escape even as much as we try. And collectively, all of this is taking a toll.
Yeah. I do believe that there isn't just one answer, it seems. As everyone I interview, it seems that there's many, many answers to why the rates are going up and children are sicker. And we just need to learn to slow it all down, right? And get back to the basics.
Yes.
You're trained in many different areas of medicine. Do you see this as an emerging trend in integrative medical care in the West? It's becoming more popular, or is this still somewhat unusual in medicine, especially in pediatrics?
I can tell you in comparison. So when I got into integrative medicine in 2008, I was for sure the oddball that, you know, was doing all kinds of voodoo. Literally, like people were like, "Oh, you're doing voodoo." In 2008, if you were prescribing probiotics, you know, that was radical at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, it's hard to
California?
imagine. In California, yeah, people like back in 2008 in the hospital system that I was in, I was trying to get them to bring some probiotics on board. So when the kids got antibiotics, you know, doctors could prescribe probiotics. And I mean, it took an act of God, literally took an act of God, because they're like, well, what is the safety? Is it known? And I'm like, these are probiotics. But, you know, we've come a long way. We've definitely come a long way. And I think the consciousness and awareness that we have and where the science is, you know, back 12 years ago, which, you know, is not a whole lot of time, or I guess 14 years ago now, I lose count. You'd think that within the short period of time that science hadn't changed, but science has changed dramatically. Like the amount of information we have on the microbiome is staggering in comparison to what was there 10 years ago. So
Mhm.
there's this explosion of information which is driving a lot of awareness. And then, thanks to people like Mark Hyman and Dr. Andrew Weil and all of these incredible leaders that have started really forging a path for more people to become aware of these concepts and ideas, we are undergoing a transformation in our way of thinking. I think we have a long way to go.
Mhm.
And, we have societies and communities that are still not aware. And, I think it's the job of everyone to take this further. But I think in comparison to where we were, we've really come a long way. And, sadly, I think there's also a lot more need. 10, 12 years ago, there were some kids who have ADHD, who had some learning issues, who had autism, but where we are now is different. And there are a lot more families saying, hey, what the heck is going on with my kid? Why is my kid suffering? Why is my kid not able to learn? And these parents are, looking for information and looking for answers.
Mhm. Well, so I happened to listen to you talk on a few times about mold, and you said something that I normally don't mention on here, which is the word vaccine. But I thought it was a safe place to ask because I found your perspective really interesting. So you said that, yes, there are children who do have vaccine injuries, which I loved just to hear you acknowledge that, because I hear and interview people who do have that. And it's my world of living in the brain injured or hurt children. Of course, I come across people who've been hurt. But you kind of dismissed it a little bit to say that there's another really big cause or factor that people are not looking at. And you were talking about mold. So, can you dive into that a little bit for me? Because we haven't really spoken a lot about mold here. And I know it's becoming a really hot topic and it causes a lot of neurological issues. It's kind of sneaky and we don't always know it's around. And it's also not shown on a lot of different tests, like
Yeah.
in the stool, the blood. I don't even know where you find mold or how you know you might have it in your body.
Fantastic question. And thank you for opening up this topic. So I'll start by sharing my perspective of where I was 8 years ago, because for the last at least 8 to 10 years, I'm not the vaccine injury person. People don't flock to me if their kids are vaccine injured, but I've seen my fair share. And what I've seen is heartbreaking, to say the least. And, pancreas is failing, kidneys failing, neurological issues, gastrointestinal issues, horrible eczema. I've seen all of these. And I think as a society, for us to say it doesn't exist is just truly unfair.
Hmm.
And when it happens, it is catastrophic and it is heartbreaking, and it is a nightmare that no parent would ever want to see for themselves. Where I was 8 years ago, I was absolutely 100% convinced that vaccines were the cause of a lot of injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And my degree of paranoia around vaccines was really high. And when I started my pediatric practice in Santa Monica, it's now a little over 8 years. I was terrified of vaccines to the point where, I was still doing them, and I was following the law and CDC requirements, but, also working with families and wherever they were. But I had a lot of hesitancy. And over the years, I had so many cases where in my own heart of hearts, I was like, oh my God, this kid is going to get this vaccine and they're going to fall apart. Oh my God, this kid is going to become autistic after I give him the MMR. But the parents wanted it. And my perspective is not to put my own bias into the mix.
Hmm.
And I was shocked so many times where I was convinced that, oh my God, this is going to happen. It didn't happen. And over the years, what I came to realize is that vaccine injuries for sure happen, but I think the rates at which they happen is less than what we think. And this is, not me being opinionated. It's just based on my observation of 8 years of providing care to kids. And up until 2 years ago, I was the one actually injecting the vaccine into the kids. And, the kids and the families were what taught me to change my perspective, because I realized, like, gosh, this isn't as common as I thought. We've had a few minor cases, thank God, of vaccine issues where one little girl, for instance, developed horrible eczema and we had to really build her system back up. One little child developed stuttering and we had to work through that. But thank God, like at least in my practice, we haven't witnessed any horrendous vaccine injury. And over time, as I've really stood back, it really had me question, what was it about these other children that I saw in consultation that had them become so sick? And ultimately, the analogy that I came up with, that I share with the families that ask me, well, what do you think? Now, I tell them vaccines are matches. They're a pro-inflammatory agent. I mean, that's what they're for, right? It's a biologic agent. You inject it into the body, it fires up the immune system, and that firing up the immune system creates antibodies and protection against X disease, right? That's what they do. So when you look at vaccines as matches, right, and you're lighting a match, you're throwing it somewhere, and then that causes a little spark and then causes an immune reaction. The thing that is most important is not the match. It is where that match lands that is ultimately dictating the course of what happens. And this is one of the things that we don't really talk about. And I was blessed enough to train with this incredible mentor of mine, Dr. Hidayat. And Dr. Hidayat is the one that told me, Pejman, pay attention to the terrain, which is basically the internal physiology, the internal body. Pay attention to that and understand that to the best degree possible, because the terrain is what ultimately dictates what happens, not the insult. And we can go, in a lot of different directions. Aren't vaccines ultimately as safe and effective and helpful as we want? And there's a lot of opinions on that. And I back out of that conversation.
Yeah, I don't want to go into that.
And neither do I. And it's not appropriate. I do think vaccines do provide protection. I do think they can be helpful. I also believe that, people should have a choice. But the point being, and, to put things in context, my kids are vaccinated. I've been vaccinated, and that's kind of where my family has gone. But point being, ultimately, if you light a match, and let's say you're in a concrete or asphalt parking lot, right? You can light 1,000 matches and throw them into that concrete, and the match will burn and then die. Match will burn and die, right? 1,000 matches will cause no kind of issue. You take one match and go into a super dry forest where there is an absurd amount of tinder that is all dry. You throw one match and you can cause the most horrendous forest fire that has ever happened, right? Same match, two different environments. One, nothing happened. One, massive explosion of fire. Mm-hmm. Our understanding of the terrain, our understanding of the internal physiology is not yet mature enough for us to be in a place to say that kid has tinder in their system. We probably should not vaccinate this child until we get everything in perfect health. And God, that kid has got, the internal milieu of a tank. You can vaccinate him 1,000 times and nothing will happen. And this is the part that is missing from our conversation, because fortunately, from what I have learned from my patients, it turns out that most kids have physiologies that are resilient enough where it seems that they can handle the vaccines well. And I've had some kids in my practice that are now 8, 9 years old, because I've seen them from birth. And the 8 or 9-year-olds that have received the vaccines are still doing fantastic, which also brought down my paranoia of, oh my God, are we causing issues that we don't understand? Obviously, I haven't seen these kids for 30 years, so I don't know if something will happen outside of that. But my focus as a pediatrician now is, how do I help families, help kids have the most resilient physiologies possible, where whether it's a vaccine or a cold or, heavens forbid, COVID or other insults, that their systems can take these insults in stride and keep maintaining that degree of health, because that's what the human body does, right? We don't live in a bubble where there's no stressor, right? That's just unrealistic. Whether it's toxins or viruses or vaccines or whatever else, stressors exist. It's how we handle these stressors that is ultimately most important.
Wow. Well, we didn't get into mold there, but we're on that. So you mentioned in one of your fellowships was endobiogeny. Is that what you're talking about here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about this field and how it informs your work?
Yeah. The study of endobiogeny really transformed, my understanding of the human physiology, and it actually changed my perspective as a person and physician. And endobiogeny is basically a conversation about how can we best understand the intelligence of the human body, and how can we best understand how to support this intelligence in what it's doing. And for instance, I love functional medicine. It's a big part of what I do. And everyone that has been in functional medicine, all the leaders, like, God bless them, because they've contributed so much. When you look at the functional medicine approach, though, it is more of a biochemical approach where basically we say, well, this enzyme is broken. We dump X amount of vitamin or mineral, whatever, to change this enzyme, and we get the thing working. Or the gut is broken. Let's pour some probiotics, colostrum, to fix the gut, and then the gut gets better. Endobiogeny takes it a step further, where it says, what is happening to this organism? Because the human body is a living organism, right? What is happening inside this organism that is causing it to behave the way it is, whether it is an outward expression of anxiety or some kind of autoimmune disease or whatever else? And it really forces us to go multiple layers deeper to a place where we say, well, what is different about this physiology? Is it a hormonal imbalance? Where is the human body struggling? And when you look at some of the other models of integrative medicine, whether it's homeopathy or osteopathy or chiropractic or Ayurveda or Chinese medicine, they all talk about this essence of life, right? The chi, or whatever you want to call it, that ultimately the body is ultimately it's doing something. It has an intelligence and it has a goal. And the goal is ultimately to grow and be healthy and maintain that health. That's the goal of the human body. When the body is not able to do that, something is hindering that vital force to express itself. And how do we get to a place where we can understand what that is to ultimately unleash that vital force? So that concept and way of looking at the body was what kind of transformed my thinking, and ultimately concepts of terrain and some of these other things that I touched on.
Right. So in your practice, how do you kind of spot or look out for a child's terrain, and to know what to do and to give that vaccine, or to say, oh, you seem like maybe we should take care of this first, and heal this first?
How many hours do we have?
We don't have that long, but let's just.
So it's a great question. I think it's a complicated question.
Yeah.
That would take a little bit of time to talk about. But in kind of Cliff Note short answer form, it's really stepping back and asking, is this child healthy in every domain? Are they healthy at an energetic level? And is this child robust and they're thriving, they're growing well, they're resilient, they're not getting sick a million times, they haven't had 15 ear infections, they're developing well, that child has the energy to run, they're climbing. And in doing this, and for me, in doing this long enough, like there's kind of a scan that takes place in my brain with every child, and I just shoot questions at the parents to really quickly create a map of where is this child at. And the beauty with children is they show us if there's something going on. They may not be able to tell us because they don't have that degree of self-awareness, and frankly most adults don't either, right? But children show us through their actions. The child who's constantly tantruming, the child who's constantly having issues, whether it's psychological or physical,
Mm-hmm.
the child who's just so tired that they don't want to play, they don't want to run, they don't want to engage. These are all signs that are very superficial, telling us that, hey, maybe there's something off in the physiology. There's something going on. And, for instance, in the kids in my practice who have had, multiple colds that lasted 3 or 4 weeks, and, if they got a pneumonia, for me, that's a big red flag. Like, hey, there's something weird going on here. Let's get the child into a really good state of health, and then we march forward with the vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this constant exchange between the parents and I, and if the children are older, like, hey, how's everything going? How's their digestive tract? Is there something funky going on there? Are they covered head to toe in eczema? And by creating these different pictures of the child, you start creating a scenario of like, is this child in optimal health or not? And in conventional pediatrics, we just say, well, this kid just has some eczema, or this kid has just had a few ear infections, and some kids get ear infections. And we just downplay these things to say, well, this is normal. Every kid gets a pneumonia. Like, why do we have to normalize pneumonias? In my world, if a kid gets one pneumonia, that's actually abnormal, because most healthy children should get a cold and then they should recover from a cold. A cold should not turn into a respiratory, asthma attack or a pneumonia or whatever else. And I'm blessed enough to work with a community where they're willing to go along with me on this conversation, because they're actually invested in the conversation. And our entire conversation really becomes of not just, they had an ear infection, we gave them an antibiotic, everything got better. It's, why the heck did that ear infection happen in the first place? And what do we need to do to make sure the system becomes more resilient, so next time the child gets a cold, they don't get an ear infection? And this is what becomes so magical about integrative pediatrics, where we can change the course of these things. And I think by having these conversations and taking the steps, by changing the diet and changing the environment, and I think this is a perfect time to talk about mold, by changing these factors, you actually change the state of health of that child, which then changes their ability to handle something like a vaccine.
Right. And I was just sitting here thinking, well, gosh, I remember what it was like when I lived in Northern California, and I went to this amazing integrative pediatrician who's my friend now. But she's not my pediatrician anymore. And I still pine for that place, because it was a guide. As a pediatrician, you're able to guide parents and not just give them, oh, they have eczema and here's a steroid. Instead, you're talking about diet and all the other things around to keep them super healthy and strong, so that they can handle these external environmental factors and vaccines when they need them. So I do want to talk about mold, but I also want to dive into, you mentioned that you work with a lot of kids with behavioral and learning challenges. Where do you want to go next?
I'll leave it up to you. You want to talk about mold, since we were touching on the environmental piece?
Yeah. Do they go hand in hand in any way?
They do. So I'll say this: in this period of time that I've been doing what I do, I've really studied a lot of different things, and I've become aware of glyphosates, and I don't think they're helpful. I've become aware of a lot of different compounds, and I don't think any of them are helpful. Mold toxins. So if other compounds are little puppies to 40-pound dogs, mold toxins are the tiger/lion that is lurking behind the scenes. And I hate to use this word, but the catastrophic physiological changes that I've seen from the mold toxins has reshaped my perspective on how mold toxins fit into everything else. And from our understanding, it seems that all of these other compounds and chemicals insidiously kind of erode the vitality of the gastrointestinal tract, the microbiome, the immune system, the mitochondria. And the mold toxins basically become the 800-pound gorilla that just breaks the back of the system and throws the system into a tailspin. And I think part of why we are not yet talking about mycotoxins or mold toxins as much is they are so impossibly hard to identify. And I've had families where they come in and we're talking because their kid has had 2 years of a rash that has not been getting better, and their guts have been a mess, and they've done gluten-free, dairy-free, probiotic, you name it, they've done it all. And they're like, why is my kid not getting better? And we do some testing, and we can touch on that in a second. And I say, it looks like you guys have mold. And they're like, no, we can't, because we've had our house tested twice. We don't have mold. I'm like, oh, no, I do think you do. Third inspector comes and like, I'll give you an exact example. We had one family, exactly that scenario. Kid was getting rashes, getting sick all the time, ear infections, respiratory issues, weird asthma. Nothing made sense. I'm like, you guys have mold. And they're like, no, we've had the house tested. We don't. I'm like, I think you've got mold. Third person comes. I had a conversation with them before. I'm like, dude, there's something going on in this house. Please be aggressive. Guy goes and actually probes the wall that is behind the bed of the little girl where she was sleeping at the head of her bed. There's black mold in the wall that the other inspectors missed because they just took an air sample of the rooms and they didn't see big spikes because the mold toxins were not coming fully through the wall. So the other inspector said there's nothing going on. There was mold behind this little girl's bed that was actually affecting her from a respiratory immunological standpoint that was throwing her into a tailspin. And I can tell you, in the integrative pediatric world, there are too few people that are yet trained well enough. And I'm not that I'm an expert by any means. I'm still getting oriented to this myself. There are too few people yet trained well enough to be able to identify it and know what to do with it. And why I say that is like what you mentioned, it is so easy to miss, not just from an environmental inspection standpoint. I've had, consultant people come to me for consultation after they've seen X, Y, or Z people, and, the other people treated their gut and they did this and they did that. Kid wasn't getting better. I looked at the labs that the other people did, and there were the signs of mold within those labs that ultimately got missed, because when we're not trained to think about something, this is just a human consciousness, right? When you're not looking for something, you end up missing it, even though it's right in front of you.
Wow. So what are the labs that can show that there's mold?
So that's a little tricky because there is no perfect lab. There is no perfect test. And I've seen tests ultimately fail in picking things up. The most useful and sensitive test is a urine mold toxin test, a urine mycotox. There's a few companies out there that are doing it. The two most reputable ones are Great Plains and Real Time Labs. The problem with the urine mycotoxin tests is, sadly, in the human beings that are most heavily affected, part of what the mycotoxins do is because they shut down detox pathways. So mycotoxins can actually shut down, not just suppress, but shut down glutathione production, where the body's ability to actually produce glutathione essentially goes to nil. They shut down liver enzyme pathways, where detoxification shuts down. So by compromising these pathways, what the mold toxins do is essentially start causing the body to be unable to excrete the toxins into the urine and ultimately out of the body. So when you test the urine, what you end up getting is a false negative because the child is affected, but the urine isn't showing it. So sometimes what I do is I'll actually test a parent along with the child if they're willing, and I'll take the healthiest person in the home and the mom or dad, whoever actually doesn't have any issues. I'll test them and the child. And sometimes the parent is just pouring out toxins like it's going out of style, but they're fine. And the child who is actually suffering shows normal results. Along with that, what I've now started doing is actually creating some redundancy. So when my suspicion for mold goes high, and there's Lyme, there's all kinds of other stuff that could be a factor. But when I see mold as being the issue, what I actually do is do the urine mycotox, but also do a test called a urine organic acid, which is basically a test that checks for weird biochemical compounds in the body that don't belong there. Because it turns out the molds produce certain chemicals on their own, which we don't. And this urine test can actually pick up those compounds. And sometimes what happens is while the mycotoxin test is negative, the organic acid test actually shows positive, because there's compounds like tartaric acid that are very specific for molds, including aspergillus, that would pop up and suddenly will go up very high. Along with that, what I sometimes do is also do a blood antibody test against the molds. And there's a company called Test that actually provides that. So I kind of create a redundancy. And there's some cases where, thank God everything is perfect. And it's like, sorry, I just wasted, $400 of your dollars. But sadly, that is oftentimes not the case. And what happens is 2 of the 3 tests are usually very positive. And then it becomes a conversation of, we've got this. Now it's just a matter of where is it?
Mm-hmm. Let's back up for a second. What are some of the other symptoms that you might see in children in your practice that are having you even think about mold? You mentioned rashes. What else?
So I think the way to understand this is to first understand what the mold toxins do to the physiology, because it's really weird. You can get all kinds of unusual presentations in terms of the mold toxicity. So you can get severe ADHD, learning problems, brain fog, inability to focus, anxiety, behavioral issues at a cognitive level. At a physiological level, you can get gastrointestinal tract changes, where the gastrointestinal tract is just weird. Some kids have abdominal pain, some kids have loose bowels, some kids end up getting constipation. You can get allergies, you can get eczema, you can get poor immunity, where the individual is just getting sick over and over again. And you can also get unusual things where there's just, the child is not growing, the child is not thriving, and they're just tired and they're just run down. And the same thing can show up for adults. But when you look at the physiological contributions of these mycotoxins or causative effects, so mycotoxins are nasty mitochondrial disruptors. In my little understanding of things, I would say that they are probably one of the most concerning mitochondrial disrupting toxins that we are probably aware of. And I would, unless someone is living in a soup of heavy metals, or living in a soup of like glyphosates in huge amounts, which typically doesn't happen, the mycotoxins can actually reach levels that are very high, except we're not aware of the fact that they are there. So they cause the mitochondria to get disrupted, which causes brain fog, because ultimately this thing is dependent on energy, right? Mm-hmm. Our neurons or brain cells are heavily dependent on energy. So when you get a disruption in energy production, the brain just starts acting really weird. You can get depression, you can get anxiety, you can get attention issues, memory problems. And ultimately, all of these can show up as sometimes ADHD, sometimes anxiety. There are some people that are looking at how mold toxins can possibly influence autism. And there are a handful of articles out there that actually are saying maybe we should be paying more attention to mold in autism. I'm not an autism expert, so I can't really comment on that. But you can get weird neurological issues. Because the mitochondria also influence hormone production, you can get issues where children don't grow. Because when you think about ultimately, how does growth happen? Right? So growth happens through the production of hormones, right? You need adequate amounts of testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, all of these different things. These hormones need the mitochondria to be converted from cholesterol ultimately to the compound that does its thing. When the mitochondria are compromised, hormone production starts getting altered. And then you compound that with the gastrointestinal tract. So we are inhaling and ingesting these spores if we're around them. And the vast majority of the children I see have gastrointestinal issues. So they get leaky gut, they get gut inflammation. I have a few kids where they have outright like colitis, so massive inflammation of the colon or intestines from these spores, because these spores are very immunogenically active. They cause a massive amount of inflammation and reactivity. So you get this weird constellation of issues where detox is compromised, the mitochondria are compromised, the gastrointestinal tract is compromised, and along with that, hormone production and other things. And once you start looking at it in that sense, you start seeing like, oh my God, like the human body starts shutting down in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. So have you, you piqued my interest with the colitis. So do you see children, have you ever had a child with early onset Crohn's?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah. What do you think is causing that so early now? Is that related or no? I know that's a whole nother topic.
I'm sure that there's more to it than just mold.
Of course.
And I think, antibiotic exposure, and sadly antibiotics and, glyphosates and these compounds are just ubiquitous, right? So we're getting microbiome alterations from very early on, potentially from birth or, prenatal for that fact, because there are studies that show that infants are not born sterile. They actually do have some colonization before they're born, and then they get all of the bifidobacters and lactobacilli when they come through the vaginal canal. But if there's constant exposure to these chemicals and you start getting alterations in the microbiome from early on, and then you have some kind of other insult, whether it's an antibiotic, and I have had one or two cases where everything was fine, child gets an antibiotic and boom, they go down. Or I have now 3 cases of really nasty, horrible colitis that we're now finding mycotoxins in, and we're trying to figure out, now in the process of trying to figure out how to resolve all of that.
So let's go down that road. How do you? That's a really complicated question, I suppose. It involves your home and then taking care of the child and healing them. So what do you tell parents when they're like, okay, great, you found it, now what?
So first thing is, depending on how sick the child is, right? So there's some kids who have just a little bit of allergy, or they've got a little bit of an issue, and there's some mold, but there isn't a catastrophe unfolding. And that's where, doing some mitigation, like putting in an air filter and just having, dropping down the mold spores is sufficient. So it's not to say that every time we need to be panicked, because thank God there's mold in everyone's home. There's no such thing as a sterile home. And to have a sterile home would be totally unrealistic. We all have mold. It is when the toxin levels and the mold spores get high enough, and you happen to have someone who is vulnerable enough to be in that environment, that really bad things can happen. And that in that scenario, like I have some families where the child's gut is falling apart, and it's like a horrendous case of Crohn's, and in that case it's like, dude, we have to like totally clean up the environment because we can't get this child past it. Or there are kids with PANS or pandas where there's massive amounts of neuroinflammation, and it was my mentors that had me open my eyes up and realize that probably 50% of what we call pandas or PANS is actually mold toxicity.
Wow.
And the mold is what's actually driving the inflammation, which is why some of these kids, are on 2 years of antibiotics, and then as soon as they come off the antibiotics, they fall apart, or they are getting constant rounds of IVIG and they're still having issues. It's because the triggering effect or the triggering source of the inflammation was never addressed, because again, the molds are hard to identify. So if someone is really, really sick, the degree of concern you have to clean their environment up is different than, oh, he's got a little allergy, he's got a little bit of eczema, but everything else is fine. And in these cases, you sometimes have to take, more dramatic measures, whether it's moving out of the home or doing a remediation where everything's cleaned up. Once that has happened, the rest of it is hard, but conceptually easy. So you have to get rid of the toxins, and charcoal and bentonite clay are the two best binders for that. So you use these compounds, you pull the toxins out of the body. You ultimately need to 50% of the time clean up the fungus that's in the body, because a lot of individuals, as they ingest these spores, they actually get an internal infection or growth of these molds. So you use herbs, nystatin, whatever, to clean the fungus and get rid of it. And then you use a few things to build up the mitochondria, build up the gastrointestinal tract, and things get better.
Mm-hmm. Well, so how are you supporting you have a lot of children right now, you mentioned with behavioral challenges that that's kind of a passion of yours to work with.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things that you're seeing, and what are some of your treatment plans, I suppose, basic treatment plans that you are onto right now?
Great question. So the big area that I've kind of grudgingly gone into, and 3 years ago when I really started becoming aware of the mold, there was a part of me is like, God, I really, 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 really don't want to do this, because it's like, God, I have to learn something completely new. And I resisted it at first until I looked around, thinking like, okay, I'll just find some expert that I can refer all my patients to. And then I realized, like, God, pediatric experts don't really exist. There's like 20 people in the entire country, sadly. So grudgingly, I ultimately started working with this amazing guy, Dr. Neil Nathan, and I'm part of his training program to become more educated. And through this, what I've realized is with a lot of the children that I see, and mind you, I'm sure there's other things that happen. So there's plenty of cases where Lyme and Lyme co-infections and viruses and other things affect the kids. So I'm attracting a particular population,
Right.
but basically the biggest population that I now serve are kids with really horrendous behavioral issues. So the kids who are completely flipping out of their heads, having massive anxiety, aggression, complete dysregulation, which is ultimately inflammation. When you see that kind of a picture, basically that child's brain is inflamed, and that inflammation is what's causing them to be so off kilter. And along with that, I serve kids who really struggle to learn. And it's not the run-of-the-mill ADHD. It's the kids who just can't process at all, or the kids who can't focus at all. And they've been on 3 different medications and nothing is helping. And the things that I find in these children is oftentimes there's a high degree of inflammation. So my first step is to really calm down the inflammation. And along with that, I don't know if you've ever gotten into the world of histamine and how it affects the nervous system.
A little bit with myself. And I'm finding some culprits, and I'm not an expert myself, but I work with people who've
Do you
told
mind
me.
sharing your experience?
I was having a lot of histamine reactions. I'm not used to sharing my own experiences on here, but I was having a whole lot of histamine reactions, meaning I was having rashes pop up on my body in places that I've never had an issue with, eczema or something. A lot of like one sip of wine would have me have a reaction, like an allergic reaction. So then I switched to just organic wine, and that worked for a little while, and then it didn't. And then I would have to no longer, my practitioner said, okay, you can't have bone broth and fermented food. And I'm like, what? Those are the healthy things. And so I had to cut those out for a while. And I think I can't really explain I can't explain it the way she did, my practitioner, but I know that I think possibly parasites had something to do with it, because they were causing some histamine among many other pathogens going on in my body, and removing implants. There's a whole lot there.
Do you mind me asking, did you feel
Sure.
a lot better when the implants were removed?
Yeah, actually, immediately I was able to breathe easier for one thing. And then the rashes that were on my trunk of my body disappeared, and they had never been there before. But I was starting to have rashes all over my hands. It looked like hand, foot, and mouth, but I don't think it was. No one else would get anything, only me. I would get like these really sick looking, like underneath my eyes. I look like they'd puff up, and I'd get rashes of eczema under
Wow.
my eyes. I don't know why.
Wow.
Um, I think, like anything, it was probably not only that. Um, it was a combination of lots of things. I'm working on it now.
Well, I learned something new every day. And I had this amazing medical student actually that was rotating with me. And we were getting into the conversations of mold. And he's like, did you know that a fair number of the implants actually are contaminated with mold? And they start growing mold. And then he started showing me these pictures of these implants that were taken out that were actually like moldy. And all of a sudden, like, oh my God, like who would have ever thought? So, I mean, it's possible that you actually had some degree of mycotoxicity because the molds also release or trigger histamine reactions from the implants, which is crazy to think about, right?
That's possible. I'm not sure if my doctor tested for mold, but he did send the capsule to the lab. And I didn't want to just go to any doctor, so I actually went out of state to another doctor who I trusted, because sometimes that's you want to make sure that that gets done properly.
For sure, for sure. But one of the things, and my patients help me learn this, is histamine also has a profound effect on the nervous system. So uh, consider this. When we take Benadryl, we typically get very sleepy and fall asleep, right? The vast majority of us pass out. How does Benadryl do that? It does that by dropping histamine levels in the nervous system. And if you imagine histamine is kind of like the accelerator of the nervous system, right? It
Okay.
maintains a certain tone within the nervous system. If you drop the histamine levels, it's almost like you take the air out of the parachute and the parachute just collapses and you fall. That is how Benadryl and some of these antihistamines cause that sedative effect. It turns out that when there is histamine in overabundance, especially within the nervous system, you actually get the opposite effect. So you get this, the analogy I give to parents, and I'm not sure if this is actually right or not, but it's my best way of thinking about it is imagine you've got the 5-year-old that has had 15 cups of coffee every day, and they're just completely tweaked out, right? They're so caffeinated that this kid is completely losing their head. They're anxious, they're reactive, they just get easily flustered. The other thing that's really, really weird about histamine in the nervous system, and again, the kids taught me this as I was observing them, is that it changes sensory pathways, it changes sensory experiences. So the kids who are hypersensitive to sound, they can't tolerate clothing. And there's a dear family of mine where their child is going through this right now, where they literally can't stand the experience of wearing clothes. Some kids can't stand the smell. So their sense of smell is just crazy over the top. A lot of this is ultimately influenced by histamine because histamine ultimately changes a lot of pathways in the vestibular system, the cerebellum, other areas that ultimately tweak how we experience the sensory information from our world. And one of the things that I found was when I was using these histamine blockades, and there's like the DAO enzymes would break down histamine in the gut. So I was using them and for other reasons. And all of a sudden, the parents would come and they're like, yeah, she's able to wear clothes, or he's not as sensitive to smell and taste. I'm like, what? What? And the kids were more calm and they were less reactive. And that is what got me to start looking. And, from like 15 years ago, I found this one random article that this one person wrote that actually talked about these pathways being there. So histamines do for sure cause allergy issues and eczema, but one of the things that we don't always think about is how they affect the brain. And it turns out the molds and Lyme and parasites can definitely trip up histamine reactions, which then cause changes within the nervous system.
You mentioned allergies a little bit there. Do you see in some of these kids who are all hyped up and very sensitive, maybe also having extreme allergies to
Everything.
everything?
Everything. Yeah. And it's a double whammy because they become so sensitized that they start reacting to everything, which further exacerbates the histamine response. But there was a very smart speaker that I was listening to, I don't know, about a year ago that actually said something that really kind of struck me. They said, when you see someone having an allergy reaction to just about everything, you need to think about mold. And as I started looking for that, all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, yeah. And a lot of the patients that I have where I do food testing, they react to everything. When I do environmental testing, they're reacting to everything.
Mm-hmm.
Families that come to see me sometimes, they're like, yeah, we went to the allergist and they did a skin prick and like everything blew up. And all of a sudden things started making sense based on what that, expert taught me. And because the mast cells and ultimately the histamine system that's controlled by these mast cells is so reactive. And the analogy I give to parents is, I'm sure we've all experienced that kind of intoxicated person who's just this angry, blithering drunk that just screaming at everyone, and they don't even know who to react to, but they're reacting to everyone. Mold does that to the immune system, particularly the mast cells, which control histamine and allergy reactions. And that part of the system literally becomes that dysregulated, angry drunk that is just angry at the world and reacting to everyone, everywhere, all the time. So it's a very sad scenario, which ultimately has a physiological reason.
Mm-hmm. Is mold so tricky? Is it something that if you come across and stay in a place that has mold for a short period of time and you can smell it and you know it's there, maybe a hotel room or a vacation home, um, it does that leave a lasting effect, or is it really when you live in a place for a certain amount of time, or is it just you never know?
I think for people who are already unwell, uh, they don't do well in moldy environments, even if it's for a brief period. But their system has already been eroded to a point where they lack that resilience. I think most healthy people, yeah, you may get a little bit of stuffy nose, some people get headaches, but that's the extent of it. To really be affected, and this is kind of the toxin conversation, right? If you get exposed to glyphosates once or pesticides or antibiotics or whatever, if it's 1 or 2 times, not a big deal, right? Your body bounces back and everything goes back to normal. If you have 20 courses of antibiotics or you're eating antibiotics in every single food for your entire life, different story.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that it's the chronic exposure that happens. And for some people, it could be 4 months. For some people, it could be 5 years, that ultimately erodes the system and causes the compromise to happen, because it's really worn the system down to the point where detox fails, gastrointestinal tract starts having issues. And the thing that really bothers me, and this is what I've really become concerned about, is if you have children, young children that grow up in mold infested environments that the family is not aware of, these are the kids that seem to struggle the most, because infants and young children have not yet developed that degree of detox capacity. Their gastrointestinal tract and microbiomes are just starting to form, and their vulnerability is different than, say, the 40-year-old adult that now moved into a moldy environment, but they were healthy before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially for these kids that spend years in that kind of an environment, not weeks, years, that is what can ultimately cause them to fall apart. And it happens with adults as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big topic we could talk about for hours. We're already 1 hour in here, though. So, do you have any time for a few more questions about?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you're currently developing Wholistic Minds. Can you tell us more about this site?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. I realized it was about 2.5 years ago now that we've been working on this, that, the thing that limits parents from understanding what they need to do to help their children is ultimately the lack of information. And, I know the wonderful pediatrician you're talking about. She's a fantastic person and friend. And, if you're lucky enough to have access to someone like her, or, people that come to see me, or, others that work with practitioners that have the training and awareness to look for these things, then you have access to that information. That also means that there are a lot of people that don't have access to information, and their children are suffering, and they're acting out, and they can't learn. And right now, Holistic Minds is just focused on the learning behavioral component. So part of what came about was, one, there's lack of access to good information, and you can't Google this stuff, right? If you type in "my kid can't learn," you get all kinds of weird things that come up, half of them being advertisements of people who have paid to pop up on your search, right? So you get kind of a skewed bias with these search engines that are basically marketing platforms. The other part of it is that even with the work that I do, and other colleagues of mine, we have to spend a lot of time to dig through the information to find the answers. And an hour and a half conversation, as much as we try to be mindful of how much we charge, comes at a cost, because for us to be able to run a practice and pay our bills, we can't do it for $50. Many of us wish we could do it for $50, but because it is so energy and time intensive to dig through this information and to search for these patterns, ultimately I realized that to make a big difference, to make a big enough difference in the world, and to help enough families here in the US and, God willing, abroad, we needed to bring down the cost of care a lot, and ultimately make the information a lot more accessible to more people. And that's when it dawned on me that at the end of the day, all I do is just pattern recognition. I ask the right questions, I dig into the right areas. And certain families that come to see me, they're like, "Why are you asking this weird question? Like, why do you care if my kid has dreams? Why do we care if this happens?" Right? I ask really weird questions where they're like, "Dude, you're so strange in this weird question, but yeah, my kid does have this thing. I don't know why you're asking it, but yes." Part of what I do is map out what is going on in that child's physiology. So I map out their terrain by asking these questions. And a few years ago, it dawned on me, like, well, all I do is just ask questions, get answers, and basically create a pattern of what's going on. And it turns out that technology and artificial intelligence is actually really good at pattern recognition, right? And that's when the light bulb went off in my head that, well, why don't we use technology and artificial intelligence to ultimately create this pattern recognition? So families go in, answer, a bunch of questions. Right now, we're about 250 questions, so it's a little time consuming. But by answering these questions, when it comes to behavioral issues, we kind of cover the entire gamut of all of the things, all of the possibilities of what could be happening to that child that can ultimately influence their learning, their attention, so forth. And by mapping this out, then we feed this information into the algorithm, and the algorithm starts creating patterns of like, well, this is not going on, but oh God, look, the 10 questions over here lit up, and these 10 questions are sometimes indicative of blah, blah, blah. And then the system basically takes this information and helps families see like, hey, your child's possibility of picking up a parasite while they went swimming in the middle of a Nebraska lake or Minnesota lake or wherever, is pretty high. And your child has had rashes and they're anxious. That could be a histamine reaction. Go talk to your doctor about getting them checked for parasites, because parasites can do this. So it gives parents information that's actionable. And then along with that, they then know exactly where to go search. So instead of just trying to dive into the ocean, hoping they can, catch the right fish, it's like, this is the fish you need to go after. And then parents start looking at the information and say, oh my God, yes, this matches my kid. Oh yeah, this matches my kid. Oh, wow, this matches my kid. Yeah, this is probably what's going on. And with non-medical things like changing the diet or taking a supplement, they can take that action on their own. But our goal is actually to then empower families to work with their physician to then say, well, your kid may have a parasite and you may want to order X, Y, or Z test, or you may have mold. You may want to order these tests with your doctor to then look at the possibility of these things being real. And our future iterations will actually be able to analyze the test. We're not there yet, but the next goal is to actually help doctors be able to look at these weird tests and make sense of it, to then empower the doctor who doesn't have a whole lot of training to now be the superstar that can really help the patient and the child get better.
Wow. So for a little context, you're talking about the quiz on your homepage of Wholistic Minds. And is it wholisticminds.com?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with a W.
Yeah, with a W. We'll link it. And it's free to take this test?
The quiz is free. We are hoping to do our beta launch, where we're actually going to invite a select number of people into the system to help us actually refine the algorithm. So we're in the process of basically running dummy scenarios through it, where I'm acting as the patient and we're working through the bugs. And we're about 4 to 6 weeks away from getting that piece done. So come the new year, we should be in a place where we can actually invite families in. So for those that are interested, visit the site now, but please go back to it come the new year.
I think this won't air till the new year.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so in that case, when you go to the site, we'll have opportunities for people to be invited into the system. And we're charging a very nominal fee that'll help us cover some of our costs. So while we're doing the beta testing and supporting the families, we can also cover some of the operational costs we have. But my goal is to really drive down the cost of care significantly so that it costs, a few $100s or $50 a month, a few $100s in total to receive the care that families want. And we will offer freemium versions of this where it won't be the full bells and whistles initially. It'll be access to information still that's useful, to really start changing this conversation, because that's at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? Helping people, helping families get healthier, and helping families get access to information that they're looking for to know how to help their child.
Yeah, I know. That's why we created the Brain Possible. I understand that. But that's a really neat tool. Thank you for creating that.
Of course. Thank you for letting me share.
And of course, it is difficult. I've lived in all parts of the country, and, they're not all California or Austin even, which wasn't California yet, meaning that a lot of times doctors are charging a whole lot of money just to see you and give you the care that your family deserves to be well. It's difficult. So are you working with patients only locally? Or
right now I am. In my practice, it's all just for licensure sake. Just people that are based in California. That's just because of the legal limitations that are there. With this portal, that changes. And basically, because now people are going through this portal, and really my goal is not to be people's doctor. It's to help people work with their doctor to kind of take the level up, the care up to another level.
Well, to be their own advocate, it sounds like.
Yeah,
so that
absolutely.
They can go to their doctor and advocate for their family and their wellness.
Yeah. And, there are a lot of doctors that want to do more. It's just they don't have the time, right? Because they're already too busy. They don't have the training, and they don't have years to go learn all of this stuff, but they really want to help. And that's what's so cool about this conversation, that the doctors that want to help, but they don't have an hour to go pour through the information. We pour through the information. We collect the information. We organize the information. We process the information and just say, here you go. Here's what we think may be going on. You confirm. And then the doctor's job also becomes easier, right? Because now they just look and say, well, that kind of makes sense. Sure. And yeah, this treatment makes sense. Sure. So it really streamlines everything. And in the process also changes the conversation. And through that, we can really bring down the cost of care, because now it's not just one expert in, this region of the country that you can go see. It actually helps the doctor who doesn't have that training now actually become a relative expert, because the system is doing all of that grunt work for them. And that's what's really exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. Very cool. We'll list it on our website. We'll have to figure out. We have a practitioner database that we're building. We can probably put that on there so people can find it. Is there anything else that you would like to say to the Brain Possible community today to be complete?
I think what I would love to leave them with, and it's your title right there, Brain Possible, right? Anything is possible. There's nothing that can't be solved. There is no problem or situation that doesn't have an answer. The only thing we need to do is get smart enough to identify and understand that answer. And when we can do that, then we take what seems to be impossible, whether it's the child who has such severe learning disabilities where we just say, well, they're just, developmentally delayed, or the child who has such severe anxiety where we say, you know what, they just have an anxiety disorder, whatever the case is. Anything is possible. The thing that we need to do is get to a place where we can all get access to the right information to change the impossible into something possible so we can help these kids. And my wish and dream is that any kid anywhere in this country and around the world can ultimately have the bright future, if they don't have it already, get a bright future where they can thrive, they can succeed, and ultimately live a really healthy, vibrant, awesome life that they love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being the resource that you are. I know you have, for anyone listening, you have a really awesome Instagram account with lots of videos and information on there as well. And Wholistic Minds. Where else can people find out about you and your work?
Right now, Wholistic Minds is a portal that we're developing, so that will become more active in the coming year.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Wholistic Kids Instagram is the predominant place right now where most of my information is going.
Perfect. It's easy. I think people find Instagram, it's become pretty helpful for, short snippets of digestible information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your time today. I know that your time is valuable and I appreciate you spending it here with me in the Brain Possible.
You're most welcome. And thank you for doing the work that you do and really bringing more awareness and education into the world, because it's so needed. So thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed our conversation today and that you learned something new. Do you have a question for Dr. K? Do you have your own story to share? We would love to hear from you. Let us know how we can be useful in your journey. Email us at info@thebrainpossible.com. Be sure to subscribe, follow, and share our podcast if that feels true for you. You may also consider visiting our website for more information on stories, therapies, and products that we think you will love. As always, thank you for spending your precious time with us at The Brain Possible. See you next week and be well.